Hey everybody, Questwise here, and today I am partaking in a little bit of heresy. By that I mean that if you've watched some of my previous videos, and if you can kind of see behind me up here on the bookshelves, I'm kind of a Star Wars fan. I always have been. Ever since I was as far back as I can remember, I've been a Star Wars fan. But today I want to come and talk to you about this. Star Trek Adventures. And why I might be a Trekkie now. So, you also might know that I've been looking for the perfect science fiction role-playing game. In my opinion, the one that I'm looking for. The science fiction game that I have been sort of yearning to try and find, and I've tried several. Of course, I've tried the Star Wars role playing game, the Fantasy Flight version. I have to admit I didn't like. I actually, in fact, got rid of all my Star Wars Fantasy Flight books. My favorite version to this day is the D6 version from West End Games, and I still own those, even though they've re-released the 30th anniversary edition of those. I still have my original copies. I've tried that. I tried Starfinder, which is up there as well too. Just fantasy in space. I've tried Traveler. Just wasn't for me. Interesting game, interesting system, but just wasn't getting what I was looking for. I wanted a game of exploration, diplomacy, and awe. And I think in Star Trek Adventures, I found that game. This might be a little bit of a longer video because I have a lot of stuff to cover. My notes cover 2 complete pages in my notebook. So let's get started. First of all, I am an unabashed Star Wars fanboy. Always have been, always will be. And I put off Star Trek, the genre as a whole, for the longest time because of that sort of unwritten rule that you can't like both, that there's always this rivalry between Star Wars and Star Trek. And I made sure that I stayed away from Star Trek as long as possible. Though I had a good friend in college who was a big fan, and so I'd watched it, and I know, I'm not complete noob. I know the difference between Klingon and a Cardassian, and I know a little bit of the lore, and I love the starship aspect of the whole thing, but it was never I don't know anything about the Klingon Cardassian / Romulan war. I don't know any of the history behind the show and behind the property itself. So for the longest time, I put off being a fan, and I'm ashamed of myself at this point because Star Trek does have a long and wonderful history and has some very, very great storylines. So a little bit of heresy there, blending of the two. Still always will be a Star Wars fan, but Star Trek has really captured a part in my heart right now. So what is this game? What is Star Trek Adventures? Star Trek Adventures is a role-playing game put out by Modiphius Entertainment. It's using the D20 system, which can be found in a lot of other games, like the Conan role-playing game. I believe the Infinity RPG uses it as well too. This is my first foray into 2D20. I've done a lot of research into the 2D20 system, and I've found a lot of people who don't like it, and I found a lot of people who love it, and have completely switched to the 2D20 system. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about what the 2D20 system is, because there's a ton of stuff on YouTube and on the web about what it is, what it can do, what it can't do. I don't have any experience outside of Star Trek Adventures with the 2D20 system, but I can say that the 2D20 system in Star Trek Adventures works brilliantly. I'm a huge Conan fan as well too. Robert E. Howard is one of my all-time favorite authors. I own just about everything he's ever written. I don't know how well the 2D20 system would capture the Conan feel, but at the same time, I feel like it works Star Trek exceptionally well. So that's all I really want to say about the 2D20 system. I'll touch on it again a little bit later. But if you don't know what it is, check it out on the web. I'm going to try to put some links below into other areas that you can find out more about it. But all I have to say about it at this point is that it works very, very well with this game. What I like about the 2D20 system is it's complex, but not crunchy, in my opinion. Crunchy, to me, means that there are tons of options and plug-and-play abilities and endless source books of optional things and doodads and whatnot. The 2D20 system of Star Trek Adventures feels to me, it feels complex. There's a lot of stuff happening, and a lot of ways that the 2D20 system interacts with those things, but it doesn't feel like there's an overwhelming amount of options of feats and all this kind of stuff that just like are contained within endless amounts of source books. So I feel that it works very, very well, that there's enough options to keep you on your toes, to keep you interested in the system, but not overwhelmingly so much. It more comes in the complexity of how it interacts with itself and the different things that you can do with the smaller amount of options that you're given. And I think that's beautiful. I think it's really great. There's been a lot of games in the past that I've tried to wrap my head around, and it's boggled me for months. This one I've read through, and I get it. It makes sense. Now there's a lot of things I want to, and I have to admit, haven't brought this to a table yet, but the first game in a long time that I've purchased that really makes me want to get to a table, like right now. Like I've been trying to put together a group of people overnight, like within the last 3 days, which is tough because people have schedules and we're adults and blah blah blah. But I'm trying to like, hey, can you do something tomorrow? Like it's just I'm trying to cram it in very, very quickly, and it's the first game in a long time that's really made me want to do that. There's been a few other games that I've purchased as of late, including like Torg, which is a great system, but it makes me just want to sit down and read and kind of experience more. Star Trek Adventures makes me want to dive in, makes me want to very much incorporate the system into my brain. I want to read it. It's all I've been thinking about for the last couple of days has just been reading this book. But it also makes me just want to get to the table instantly. And that's, I think, to me, why it's become a favorite game within a week. Because it's the kind of game that makes me want to get it to the table and makes me want to start telling stories and makes me want to start sharing it with people who haven't seen it before. That's what I'm going to say about the 2D20 system. Why do I like it? It's narrative. It's very, very narrative. It's extremely narrative. It wants to tell stories. It wants to collaborate with people and build relationships and to tell these stories of exploration and diplomacy and discovery. It's open storytelling. I had this discussion with a coworker the other day about the differences between role-playing in Star Wars and role-playing in Star Trek. I think I mentioned this in a previous video, and if you go back in the catalog and look at my Star Wars videos and a few others, I had a discussion about how sometimes a licensed property as a role-playing game, to me, becomes very difficult to play. Because I feel like I'm constrained by the property itself. And this discussion I had the other day with a coworker was that Star Wars is a very linear game. There's a history. You know, you can go back as far as like the Knights of the Old Republic or further if you want. But it tracks a very linear sort of storyline forward. And there's not a lot of sort of options. I don't know how to sort of convey this, because I'm sure there's going to be a lot of people who disagree with me. But for me, I guess in being a fan for my entire life, I've sort of compartmentalized Star Wars into this sort of linear story with no ability to branch off. Now, there's a place to tell a lot of stories. So, for instance, they have the whole Rebellion era. That there's tons of space to tell stories, but I feel like I'm sort of constrained for some reason. Like, there's only a certain amount of stories that could be told. I don't know if that makes any sense at all. But I feel like Star Trek gives me the ability to sort of create new stories, to create new drama. Again, I'm stumbling over my thoughts on how to convey this, but I feel like Star Trek is finally, and maybe it's because I'm new to it, maybe because I haven't spent my entire life with it, that I feel like there's so much more to explore, that there's so many more places to go, and so many more great stories to tell. Now, maybe had I, been a Star Trek fan instead of a Star Wars fan my entire life, I might feel the complete opposite about it. I'm not really sure where that comes from, but I felt constrained by the Star Wars line, and I felt very intimidated by Star Wars. Star Trek Adventures makes me feel like there's a whole new universe to explore, and I'm excited to explore it. That's what's really awesome about this. I mentioned earlier I didn't like the Star Wars Fantasy Flight system. It didn't feel very Star Warsy to me. I prefer the D6 system. It feels more cinematic. It feels more like Star Wars. While the 2D20 system feels perfectly right for Star Trek Adventures. I don't think Star Trek Adventures could have been as popular had it been a D20 system, like a standard D20 system, like used in D&D or some of the other games out there. And I don't think it would have done as well as a D6 system. The D6 system feels very cinematic and action-packed. Star Trek Adventures doesn't need to be action-packed all the time, because it wants to tell more stories about, again, discovery and exploration and diplomacy. So I think it works very, very well with the 2D20 system. The book is beautiful. It's very well produced. It's gorgeous. It's very well bound. It's stitched and glued and sewn. The interior of this is all done in the LCARS type layout from the Next Generation era. It feels like it feels like you're part of that universe. It's very, very well done. Has tons of great graphics. So as far as production value and layout, it's gorgeous. It's a beautiful, beautiful book. Now, don't get me wrong. The Fantasy Flight Star Wars stuff is beautiful as well. It's gorgeously produced. In fact, I think I'd prefer maybe the art in the Star Wars Fantasy Flight stuff a little bit better than some of this. Some of this is a little wonky. There's a few artwork pieces in here that are a little like, the face looks a little strange. But it works, and it's done very well. And it's not screen captures. None of it's screen captures. None of it's stills from the shows and the movies. It is all original artwork. And I like that a lot. I prefer that over screen captures and movie stills. It's unique in that it can be played in 3 different eras of the Star Trek universe. Currently, at this point, at least the core rulebook lets you do the Enterprise era, which is the very early beginnings of of Star Trek history, with the Federation begins to be prominent in the universe. The Vulcans have been on Earth for about 100 years and have started to influence our things, and we begin to start to explore. In fact, the very first episode of Enterprise TV show is when we're first introduced to the Klingons, or the humanities introduced to the Klingons. You can also play in the original series era, so you're talking about like Kirk and Spock and Sulu and Uhura and all these great characters that we have kind of known and loved over the years. And then in the Next Generation era, and actually the book kind of defaults to the Next Generation era because it includes everything. There's certain things that you know, and it breaks it down very simply in that, like, if you're playing in the original series era, it's you know, there's certain aliens that are just unavailable. We just haven't encountered them yet in the universe. Next Generation gives you a little bit more technology and how that works, and so it defaults to that level. But it seems to be, and I haven't played this yet, but it seems to be that it would be easy to sort of move from era to era. There are things. There's lots of things that are very similar, like phaser technology and warp drives and that kind of stuff. But there are subtle differences between each era that make it feel distinct and different. The book has lots and lots and lots of information for old and new Star Wars or Star Trek fans. Excuse me. There's tons and tons of lore. What I really appreciate about this book is that I would say 85% of it is fluff. It is simply a great resource book. Even if you're not a role-playing fan, if you're just a fan of Star Trek or you want to learn more about Star Trek, 85% of this book is written in a style that is just narrative fluff. Here's some background on warp technology. Here's some background on the different races. Here's some ideas on how phaser technology works or cloaking technology works. And then the rules are sort of encapsulated at the very ends of those sections on how they work and how they interact with the 2D20 system. I love that. I think that's brilliant. Sometimes when you're reading role-playing game core books or just books in general, it feels like reading a VCR manual. You know, it just becomes tedious of like numbers and modifications, and it's just this endless lines of crunch. I love the fact that I can read this and I can just have a good time reading it like a narratively written thing. And there's also little asides and little captures of like of like captain's logs and of different alien species talking about the universe and the happenings and the histories and the conflicts and everything. It's all very, very well done. I really appreciate that. Might not appeal to everybody, but I think it is probably one of the best role-playing game core books I have ever read to this date. 85% of it, I would say, is just narrative fluff with the rules sort of encapsulated at the end for how each of that fluff applies to the game and to the 2D20 system. I appreciate that, Modiphius. I really do. It also talks about science and technology in the 24th century, how things have changed, how things are better now, how medicine is better, how we've eradicated a lot of diseases, how different spatial anomalies work, like, black holes and solar flares and just things that you're going to encounter while you're out there, as well as like different alien species and how they how they live, and it's kind of it's simplified here, but I know that there's a source book on the beta quadrant that has just come out that goes into more detail about, say, like the Klingons and some of the other species and stuff as well. So you get a little bit more detail about their homeworlds and stuff. The core book tries to fit a lot in there, and so that's kind of a brief overview of how those work. Why do I love this book? I've been looking for a great science fiction RPG. The great science fiction RPG for me. Now I know there are tons of other Traveller fans out there that would say, "No, Traveller's way better," or maybe GURPS would run it better, or they love Starfinder, and that's fine. That's fine, and that's what I appreciate about the role-playing game hobby, is that there's something out there for everybody. But for me, I was looking for a very specific thing, and I put this off for way too long. And at the end of this this little rant, this video, I'll talk about some of the people that influenced me to pick this up, and a little special thank you to them as well. But I put this off for far too long, and I think I finally found it. I've been through a lot of other science fiction RPGs, and this is the one. this is the one. I think this is the one that perfectly fits what I'm looking for to run in a game, and hopefully what my players are looking for as well too. It's based on exploration. It's based on discovery. It's based on diplomacy. It's wonderfully narratively driven. My all-time favorite thing about this book, the very first thing I noticed that made the decision for me when I opened this book, was that when you come to the conflict section of the book, the very first section is on social interaction and not physical combat. I knew at that moment that I saw social interaction coming before physical combat. This was the science fiction role-playing game I was looking for. Do I want combat? Do I want cool space battles and ship battles and stuff in my game? Absolutely yes. Resounding yes. That's what I love about the Star Trek universe, is the cool way that the ships interact and the cool space battles and the different aliens and their technology. But what I wanted from a game was, I wanted exploration and I wanted discovery and I wanted diplomacy first. And this game definitely puts that at the forefront of its concept, of its design. So thank you for that. It's exactly what I was looking for. There's plenty of support for this game too. Another thing I really love about this game is that it looks like Modiphius is putting out plenty of support. There's source books. There's a game master screen. There are miniatures for the game. This is the only downside I see to this whole production. I love miniatures. In fact, I shortly in the future here, I want to do a video, maybe even a short series on how to use miniatures to enhance your game, not to run your game. Because when I use miniatures in my role-playing experience, I use them as a narrative tool. I don't, if I use a grid, it's very hazy on distances and stuff. It's all very narratively driven. And I want to do a video explaining to you how it is that I use them a little bit differently than than normal. But I do love miniatures. And especially in a science fiction game, I want to have starship miniatures. Now, Modiphius, as of yet, hasn't produced any starship miniatures for the Star Trek line. But WizKids does. WizKids has a game called Star Trek Attack Wing, which plays very similar to, uses basically the same rule system as the Star Wars X-Wing Battles game. And I love Star Wars X-Wing Battles. If you've heard me talk about this before, I've played in some tournaments. I've actually won a tournament one time. Kudos to me. I love space battles, and I love Star Wars universe. But WizKids has their own sort of version of that called Star Trek Attack Wing, and they produce some ships. Now, I wouldn't use the Star Trek Attack Wing to play the space battles, because I think Star Trek Adventures, the role-playing game, has a beautiful way of running starship battles. I do want the figures, though. I do want the ships, so that I can kind of like lay out on a tabletop, kind of a narratively driven, like, here, your ship is here, the Klingon ship is here, it's closing, that kind of stuff. And I'll go into that later when I do my section on using miniatures to enhance your game. So you can get them. They're a little expensive because they're $15 roughly for a regular size ship for Star Trek Attack Wing. And comes with a lot of stuff you're not going to need. All I really need for this game is just the ship and the base it stands on. If you buy them from WizKids, you're going to have a bunch of cards and a bunch of cardboard and a bunch of other tokens and stuff that you're not going to need for this game. But I just discovered today that a lot of people were unhappy with the paint schemes from the Star Trek Attack Wing game. So what WizKids did, beautiful, listening to your fans, absolutely the best way to run a company. They are producing unpainted Star Trek ships. I believe there's 12 of them out currently, that come with just the pegs and the base to stand on. No cardboard, no cards, no chits, no baubles. just the ship unpainted, which Star Trek ships would be really easy to paint, or you can be as elaborate as you want, with the pegs on the base for $6. $6. You can't even buy dice that cheap, okay? $6, you get a Star Trek ship. I'm gonna want multiple, like, Klingon vessels. I'm gonna want, a few different Star Trek Federation ships and that kind of thing. And I hope that they continue to do these unpainted ones in the future. I like to paint, even if you're not a great painter. I think that the Star Trek ships would be really easy. They're already pre-primed. You just put a wash on them, a little touch of blue or red or green or whatever, and you're ready to go. $6. I think that's genius. Now, the downfall to this is that Modiphius is producing, I think they're 30 millimeter. I can't remember the exact dimensions, but they're creating, away team figures. So they're producing figures that are, of the Next Generation crew. So like Picard and Riker. There's an original series crew figurines, which is cool. They're a little bit bigger than standard miniatures, like bigger than 25, a little bit bigger than, maybe more on the scale of like a Warhammer 40K figure, maybe a little bit bigger. They've got like a Klingon away team. They've got a bunch of different stuff coming out. Kind of expensive for the box of like 10 figures or whatever that you get. Kind of on the steep side of pricing. I don't know as if I would ever really use a lot of the away team stuff. I think more of that interpersonal relationship, individual player characters and NPCs would be done a lot with narrative thing. So what I'm really looking for in this game are the ships, and thank you to WizKids for being able to produce those things at an affordable amount. The other thing I really love about this game is that in the Star Trek universe, and I've seen this a lot in a lot of other role-playing games and stuff as well too, you have a player character. You have a character that you've created that has its own unique background, its own traits, all that kind of great stuff. Sometimes that character doesn't fit into the current storyline that you're telling. So if you have a barbarian or a druid in a fantasy game and you go into a city, they're sort of out of their element. Does that create great storytelling moments, great role-playing moments? It can. Sometimes it can hamper the players, and it makes them feel as if they're sort of out of place and that they don't have anything to do. What's a druid going to do in a city, right? So this kind of same concept also falls into Star Trek Adventures. There's an idea that sometimes the captain is not going to go on the away team mission because he needs to stay in the command of the ship, or, vice versa. There might be other things going on. What I love about this game is that they've thought about that already, and what they've done is they've created a system where you create, as a group, a supporting crew of characters. All right, these are they're not NPCs because they're played by the player character. They're played by the players, and they're created by the players. They're not necessarily opponents or villains. They are other members of the starship crew or the starbase crew or whatever you're doing that can take the place of the player's character when that player's character isn't involved in the scene that's happening. So, if the player who's playing the captain decides he's sending an away team to this planet to investigate whatever, but he needs to stay on the ship, what's that player going to do? Is he just going to go off and get a drink, something to eat or whatever for a while the rest of the players play out the scene? No, he doesn't have to. He can now create a crew member of the ship that can go with the away team, and he can play that character for a while. The other great thing is that those supporting characters don't go away after that scene is over. If they survive, they're added into the sort of this like list of characters that they're always there to draw upon, and they can advance over time as well too. They can also gain traits, they can also gain experience, they can also gain sort of backgrounds, and become like members of the family. They become actual official members of the crew that can be called upon if they're ever needed. So you might have a chief engineer, and he's going to go do some kind of engineering project or some kind of away team mission kind of thing. but you don't really need the captain there, or you don't need the security officer there. So you might create a supporting character that's also an engineer. It's going to help the chief engineer do something. And as always a character, everybody always gets a chance to play and be active and feel like they have a part in the story that's being told. Love it. Absolutely coolest thing I've ever seen in a role-playing game. Beautiful. Great, great stuff. All right. I could go on for hours about this. This video is already way too long as it is. I hope you've stayed to watch this long, because right now I have some special thanks to give out. In my quest to find the perfect science fiction role-playing game for myself, I went through a lot of different games. I watched a lot of videos on YouTube. I read a lot of articles on the web. I want to thank first and foremost Patrick Goodman, a fellow YouTuber, a fellow role-playing gamer, but also one of the writers on Star Trek Adventures, who, when I was putting out there that I was looking for a game, he made the suggestion that I try out Star Trek Adventures and gave me a little push and said, hey, check some of this stuff out. And, go watch these, go read this, here's something here. And so thank you to Patrick. That definitely pushed me over the edge, and I'm glad I followed your advice and bought this book, because it really has become my very favorite. At this current time, I would say, if anybody asked me today, what's your favorite role-playing game, I would say Star Trek Adventures. So thank you to Patrick for that. I also want to say thank you to the complex game Apologist. I'll put a link to his videos down below, but he does an entire series on the Star Trek Adventures role-playing game when it first came out, and it breaks it down into sections of, like, here's how starship combat works, here's the theory behind the philosophy of this and that. There's a great, great series done by him. I want to thank him because he really influenced my decision as well. And to Mike Dukes. Mike, if you're watching this, thanks, buddy, because it was always the pictures that you posted of your game nights and of preparation for game nights and the little stylish and artistic way that you did it that made this game feel really appealing to me. So Mike Dukes, thank you for that as well, too. So I have to say, again, I've dabbled in a little bit of heresy, but I think that I might consider myself a Trekkie now. I've been starting to read some of the novels. I've been binge watching the shows on Netflix. I've been poring over this book, trying to learn as much about the history and philosophy of Star Trek as possible. Have I given up on Star Wars? No, absolutely not. I feel very comfortable in my heart being able to love both of them at the same time. And if that makes me a heretic, then so be it. But yes, so thank you everybody for watching this. I hope this influences you a little bit to try out Star Trek Adventures. I want to get this to a table right away, and when I do, I'm going to try to do some video of the actual play, of introducing people to it and learning the game myself. But as always, try to find a friendly local game store that has this and buy this product from them. If you don't have a friendly local game store near you, try to find one that will support you. And game on, my friends. I can't say enough about this game, and I really hope you check it out. So thank you, everybody. I'm Questwise, and until next time, we're out.